The velour room didn't advertise. Didn't need to. If you had to ask where it was, then you weren't the kind of person it wanted. Tucked behind a steel door on North Wacker Drive, Chicago, it existed in the kind of quiet that money buys. Heavy curtains, low amber lighting, tables spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private. The kind of place where deals were sealed without paper and enemies smiled at each other over imported wine. Dorian DeLorenzo sat near the back. He always sat near the back. He was 34, with the kind of stillness that people mistook for calm until it was too late. Dark suit. No tie. A glass of something amber in his right hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He wasn't here for the food. He wasn't here for the ambience. He was here because Elizabeth Hale had insisted, and for now, only for now, he was still giving her that much. Elizabeth sat across from him. She wore a cream dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her dark hair pinned back in the way that made her look like she'd walked off the cover of a political magazine. Which technically she had. Twice. She was 29 and had the bearing of a woman who had never once been told no and had built her entire identity around that fact. "Your people are getting sloppy," she said, not looking up from the menu. "The Bridgeport situation was handled poorly. My father noticed." Dorian said nothing. His eyes moved slowly across the room, not out of boredom but habit. He catalogued exits. He counted staff. He noted the couple near the window who'd arrived before them and hadn't ordered yet. His mind never stopped working even when his face looked perfectly empty. "Dorian." Elizabeth's voice sharpened just slightly. "Are you listening?" "I always listen," he said quietly. "I just don't always respond." She gave him a look that was almost a smile but landed closer to warning. Their engagement had been announced 6 weeks ago. A strategic union brokered by two powerful families who needed each other's reach. There was no love in it. There wasn't even warmth. It was a transaction dressed in a diamond ring, and both of them knew it. The difference was Elizabeth had decided to enjoy the power that came with it. Dorian had simply accepted it as the cost of a larger plan he hadn't finished calculating yet. He lifted his glass. Set it back down without drinking. His eyes drifted toward the far side of the room where a waitress had just emerged from the kitchen. She moved through the dining room the way still water moves, quietly, without urgency, but with a direction that nothing was going to interrupt. She was in her late 20s, with dark eyes that took in the room in exactly the way a person takes in a room when they've learned to read it fast. Her uniform was pressed. Her expression was composed. Not the forced composure of someone pretending to be calm. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper. She reached their table and offered a slight, professional nod. "Good evening. My name is Alara. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Her voice was soft and even, like something measured. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Elizabeth didn't look at her immediately. She finished her sentence about a charity gala she was planning, let it hang in the air long enough to make a point, and then slowly turned her gaze upward. "I'll have the seared duck with the black truffle reduction," Elizabeth said. "Off menu. The kitchen knows the preparation." Alara held her gaze without blinking. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The kitchen isn't able to prepare that tonight." It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't rude. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the same ease as a weather report. But something in the directness of it made Elizabeth's fingers tighten just slightly around her menu. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said in a tone that communicated she was not, in fact, sorry at all. "The chef is working with a reduced team this evening," Alara said. "The full off-menu service isn't available. I'd be happy to suggest something from our current selection that I think you'd enjoy." Elizabeth set her menu down slowly. The gesture was deliberate, the kind of deliberate that people use when they're deciding how large to make a scene. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 3 years, she said. "They have never told me no." "Then tonight is a new experience," Alara said simply. The words weren't sarcastic, weren't sharp, but they landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward across the table. Dorian's eyes shifted to the waitress. Just barely. He hadn't reached for his drink. Hadn't moved. But something in his posture had changed, subtle enough that no one at the table would have caught it except someone trained to look. Elizabeth's voice dropped lower, which was somehow worse than if she'd raised it. "I want an apology. And I want what I ordered. Tonight." "I understand your frustration," Alara said. I can't offer the dish, but I can offer my sincerest attention to making sure the rest of your evening is excellent. The dining room had gone quieter than it should have. Not completely silent. Silverware still clinked, glasses still moved, but conversations had dropped half a volume, and eyes that weren't supposed to be watching were watching. Elizabeth stood up from her chair. Not dramatically, fully. Like someone who had decided the ground rules of this interaction needed to be redrawn. Neil, she said. The word hung in the air of the velour room like a match held over gasoline. Neil, and maybe then you'll learn how to speak properly to someone like me. Alara didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't look around the room for backup or drop her eyes to the floor. She held Elizabeth Hale's gaze with the same steadiness she'd held it from the beginning, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then quietly, almost gently, "No." The restaurant held its breath. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." "No." Alara's voice didn't rise. "I won't be doing that." Elizabeth stepped closer. Close enough that her voice wouldn't carry beyond the table, though the silence in the room made it carry anyway. "Do you know who I am?" And Alara looked at her. Really looked at her the way you look at something you've already assessed and filed away, and said calm as morning, "And who exactly are you?" Something cracked in the air of that room. Not loudly. Not with drama. The way ice cracks under weight. A sound that tells you everything about what comes next. 3 nearby tables went completely still. A waiter near the bar stopped moving mid-step. And Dorian De Lorenzo, who had not looked away from his glass in the last 4 minutes, looked up. Elizabeth's face went through something complicated in the space of 2 seconds. Fury. Disbelief. And underneath both of those, something uglier. The recognition that for the first time in a very long time, a room full of people had just witnessed someone refuse to shrink in front of her. She picked up her wine glass. And she threw it. The glass shattered against Alara's collarbone and shoulder, dark red liquid splashing across her white uniform, dripping down her neck, soaking into the collar of her shirt. Fragments of glass hit the floor. The sound was sharp and final in the silence of the room. Alara didn't move. Not a step back. Not a raised hand. Not a sharp intake of breath. She stood exactly where she'd been standing, wine running down the side of her face, and her expression didn't change. She blinked once slowly and held Elizabeth's gaze. That stillness, that terrible measured stillness, was not the response of someone who was scared. It was the response of someone who had already considered this possibility. Someone who had already decided what they would and wouldn't do when it happened. Elizabeth. Dorian's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the thing people never understood about him. He didn't need volume. The room was so still that his voice reached every corner of it without effort. He hadn't stood up. He was still seated, glass on the table in front of him, one hand resting flat on the white linen. He wasn't looking at Alara. He was looking at Elizabeth with an expression that was perfectly, carefully neutral. "Sit down." "Sit down, Elizabeth." There was something in his tone that Elizabeth's instincts recognized even if her pride didn't want to. She sat. Dorian finally looked at the waitress. At Alara. His eyes moved over her slowly, not in the way a man looks at a woman, but in the way a man looks at a problem he's trying to understand. Something moved behind his expression. Not recognition exactly. Closer to the edge of it. "I apologize for the disruption," he said, and though he was technically speaking to Alara, the words were directed at Elizabeth like a warning wrapped in politeness. "If you weren't who you are," he said softer now, and the next part he let hang just long enough, "this would already be over." Elizabeth went very still. He hadn't defended her. He hadn't threatened the waitress. He had, with 4 words and a pause, made it clear to everyone at that table exactly where the line was, and that Elizabeth had just stumbled past it. Dorian kept his eyes on Alara. He studied her the way he studied everything, methodically without showing that he was doing it. The way she'd stood when the glass hit her. The way she hadn't reached up to wipe her face. The way her feet were planted, weight balanced, body angled ever so slightly in a stance that wasn't a waitress's stance. It was the stance of someone who had been trained. "Who taught you to stand like that?" he asked. His voice was low enough that it didn't carry beyond their immediate space. Alara looked at him for the first time with something other than professional detachment. A long breath moved through her, slow and controlled. "Someone you buried," she said. Dorian didn't react. His face didn't change. But the quality of his stillness changed. The way the air changes right before lightning, a shift in pressure that the body registers before the mind catches up. Elara leaned forward slightly, just enough, and spoke a name that she hadn't said out loud to anyone in 11 months. Marcus Vale. The name hit Dorian like a physical thing. Not a flinch. Not a gasp. Something subtler and more devastating. A crack in the composure that had never cracked. His jaw tightened. His eyes changed. For a fraction of a second, Dorian De Lorenzo looked like something he almost never looked like. Human. Marcus Vale had been dead for 6 years. Officially. There was a grave with his name on it in a cemetery outside of Naples, Italy. His records had been scrubbed from every database Dorian's organization had access to, which was most of them. He had been a ghost for 6 years, and not the kind of ghost that haunts. The kind that has been made to disappear by people with very specific reasons to need him gone. And this woman, this waitress standing in front of him covered in wine, had just said his name like she'd been carrying it for a long time, waiting for exactly the right moment to set it down. Dorian turned slowly to Elizabeth. "Leave," he said. Elizabeth blinked. "What?" "Leave the restaurant. I'll be in touch." "Dorian, whatever she said to you." "Elizabeth." His voice didn't change. It never changed. "Leave." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Elizabeth Hale, daughter of Senator Richard Hale, engaged to the most powerful organized crime figure in the Midwest, sat for 3 full seconds in the most expensive restaurant in Chicago and understood, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, what it felt like to be dismissed by someone who meant it. She stood, collected her clutch, and walked out without another word. Because the alternative was worse, and some part of her, the part that had grown up watching her father navigate power, recognized that she'd already lost this particular exchange the moment she'd thrown that glass. The room exhaled. Dorian didn't watch Elizabeth go. He was still looking at Elara. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I'm on the clock. You've been waiting for me. Sitting down won't change that." Pause. Then Elara pulled out the chair across from him, Elizabeth's chair, and sat down with the kind of composure that had no performance in it. "How long?" he asked. 11 months, she said. "I started here 2 weeks after you were scheduled to return from Europe. You postponed 3 times. He studied her. "The manager knows you?" "As Elara Quinn. References checked out. Work history is clean. I've been a model employee." The smallest pause. "I needed a reason to be here when you came back." Dorian leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the kind of look that had made men across 4 states reconsider their decisions. "You infiltrated my restaurant." "I got a job at a restaurant you own," she said. "I waited. That's all I did." "That's not all you did," he said. "That's the end of a very long chain of preparation. I want to know what's at the beginning of it." He let her leave that night without further questions. Not because he trusted her. Because he trusted his own instincts more than he trusted anything else, and his instincts told him that pressing her here, in a room that was still processing what it had just witnessed, was not the right move. He needed to know who she was before he knew what she wanted. By midnight, his security team had pulled everything they could on Elara Quinn. And that was the problem. The file was perfect. Too perfect. Employment history with no gaps, an apartment lease that checked out, a social security number with 12 years of clean returns attached to it. No criminal record. No unusual contacts. No red flags. Which was itself a red flag. Real people have inconsistencies. They have parking tickets and missed rent payments and ex-boyfriends who'd blocked them on social media. Elara Quinn had none of that. She was the paper version of a person, clean and complete and assembled with the precision of someone who knew exactly what investigators look for. He ordered full surveillance. Around the clock. Her apartment. Her routes. Her contacts. What his team reported back by morning was this. At 2:17 a.m., Elara had made a call from a prepaid phone she kept in the lining of her coat. The call lasted 43 seconds. The recipient was identified only as Jonas. And what she said was simple. "You've been seen." Dorian wasn't the only one watching her. His security chief came to him with something that made even Dorian's measured pulse tick slightly faster. Elara Quinn was being tracked by 3 separate parties. His own surveillance team. A second group, professional, clean, no obvious affiliation. who'd been watching her apartment for at least 2 weeks before Dorian's people started. And a third, political surveillance, the kind that ran through channels connected to federal contractor networks. 3 sets of eyes on one waitress. Dorian stood at the window of his penthouse and turned this over slowly in his mind. She wasn't just a woman with a connection to a dead man. She was a woman sitting at the center of something that had already been moving before she walked into his restaurant. Something that had already drawn the attention of people with far longer reach than a single Mafia boss's security detail. Whatever Marcus Vale had known before he disappeared, she was carrying it. And the people who'd wanted Vale silent were trying to figure out how much of it she had. He visited his uncle the next afternoon. Carmine De Lorenzo was 71 and had the hands of a man who had built things with them and the eyes of a man who had watched those things get burned down and built again. He lived in a house on the North Shore that he refused to leave and refused to talk about the old days in. Except he always ended up talking about the old days. Marcus Vale, Dorian said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, coffee going cold between them. Carmine went still in the way old men go still when a name finds them they weren't expecting. "Where did you hear that name?" Carmine asked. "A waitress said it to me last night." Carmine looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked out the window. "Marcus didn't die," Carmine said finally. "You know that. You've always known that. You just never asked." "I'm asking now." His uncle turned back to him. "Marcus found something. 6 years ago. Something that was going to pull a lot of powerful people underwater if it ever came to the surface. People who couldn't afford to go underwater. Pause. He came to your father. Told him what he'd found. Your father helped him disappear, not to erase him. To protect him. To buy time. Time for what? Time for someone to figure out how to use what he'd found without getting buried alongside him." Dorian sat with that for a long moment. His father had been dead for 3 years. He'd taken whatever architecture he'd built around this secret with him. And now a woman named Alara had walked into his restaurant with Marcus Vale's name on her lips. "Who is she?" he asked his uncle. Carmine looked at him steadily. "If she told you Marcus's name, she's someone he trusted enough to send." He met her 2 nights later. Not at the restaurant. At a private space he owned above a bookshop in Lincoln Park, the kind of place that wasn't in anyone's records. Alara came alone. She wore her own clothes, dark jacket, dark trousers, and she looked different out of uniform. Not smaller. More defined. Like without the framework of the job to operate inside, you could see the actual shape of who she was. She sat across from him at a plain table with a single lamp between them and didn't wait for him to set the terms. "Marcus Vale is my grandfather," she said. "He's alive. He's been living under a different name in a town outside of Lisbon for 6 years. He's 73 years old and his health is declining, and he needs this to end before he runs out of time." Dorian sat with his hands folded on the table. "And how?" "The truth," she said. "Exposed. In a way that can't be buried again." "What truth?" She looked at him. "The truth about who built their empire on the back of yours." She laid it out slowly and without emotion, the way someone lays out evidence that they've been carrying for so long it no longer has the power to shock them. Senator Richard Hale, Elizabeth's father, had not built his political empire through fundraising and legislation alone. 15 years ago, when he was still a city council member trying to climb, he had found a more efficient path. He had routed campaign money through a network of shell companies connected to organized crime. Not Dorian's organization specifically, not at first. But as Hale's reach expanded, he had leveraged connections that ran through the Lorenzo network without Dorian's knowledge. Contracts awarded. Shipments overlooked. Territory quietly protected by political decisions that seemed unrelated until you traced them. Marcus Vale had traced them. He'd been the De Lorenzo family's fixer for 20 years. The man who followed the money, who read the signs, who understood that in the world they operated in, information was more dangerous than anything else. And when he put together what Hale was doing, using Dorian's organization as a hidden infrastructure for his political ascent, he understood 2 things immediately. First, if it ever came to light, it would destroy the De Lorenzo operation. Not because of what they'd done, but because of what they could be made to look like they'd done. Second, Hale would do anything to make sure it never came to light, including making Marcus Vale disappear. "He knows," Alara said. "Hale knows that Marcus is still alive. He's been trying to locate him for 3 years. That's why I'm being watched." They think I'm his contact point. You are his contact point, Dorian said. Yes, she said. But they don't know what I have. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and placed a small drive on the table between them. Marcus spent 6 years compiling everything, she said. Every transaction. Every communication. Every shell company, every contract, every name. Scanned documents, recorded conversations, financial trails. It's all on there. Encrypted, backed up in 3 separate locations with instructions for release if anything happens to either of us. Dorian looked at the drive without touching it. This is enough? He asked. It's enough to end careers, she said. Political careers. Financial empires. And it's enough to show exactly how the De Lorenzo name was used without consent and against your interests. Pause. Your father knew this was coming. He helped Marcus stay alive long enough to finish it. He just didn't live long enough to see it through. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them threw shadows against the walls of the small room. Outside, somewhere on the street below, a car moved slowly past and was gone. Whoever controls this controls the outcome, he said. Yes, Ilara said. Which is why I came to you. Because it shouldn't be me. And it was never supposed to be Marcus alone. She met his eyes. It was supposed to be you. He was still working through what she told him when the message arrived. It came through a channel only Elizabeth had access to, a direct line to his encrypted phone that he'd given her when the engagement was formalized, an arrangement meant for emergencies. He read it once. Then again. You should have chosen differently. 6 words. No context. No signature. But he didn't need one. He'd grown up reading subtext. He understood immediately that this wasn't a message from Elizabeth out of jealousy or wounded pride. This was something that had been coordinated. Something that meant the Hale family had already learned about his conversation with Ilara, had already decided how to respond, and had decided the response was escalation. He called his security chief at 11 p.m. How many of my people report to someone else? He asked. A pause on the other end of the line. Sir. Inside my organization. How many of them have a second conversation happening that I'm not part of? Another pause, longer. The kind of pause that was itself an answer. Find them, Dorian said. Tonight. He called Elizabeth the next morning. Not to argue. Not to explain. The engagement is over, he said. I'll have the ring returned by the end of the week. Dorian. It's done, Elizabeth. I'd encourage your father to think carefully about what comes next. He ended the call. For a moment he sat in the silence of his office. The real office, not the one on paper, the one in the building on Michigan Avenue where the walls held more history than the city's museums. He thought about his father. About the choices a man makes when he decides that protecting something matters more than keeping himself safe. About the difference between power that is taken and power that is chosen. He picked up his phone and called Ilara. I'm in, he said when she answered. Tell me what we need. They flew to Lisbon 4 days later. The town was small and coastal, the kind of place where the streets were too narrow for cars and old men sat outside cafes until the light changed. The house Marcus Vale lived in was modest. A whitewashed 2-story with blue shutters and a garden that someone tended with care. Nothing about it suggested the man inside had once been the most dangerous information broker in the American underworld. Marcus answered the door himself. He was older than the photographs Dorian had seen. Smaller in the way that age reduces people not by taking things away but by concentrating what remains. His eyes, though, his eyes were the same. Patient. The eyes of a man who had spent 6 years waiting for something he'd refused to stop believing in. He looked at Dorian for a long moment. You look like your father, Marcus said. Everyone says that, Dorian replied. They mean it as a compliment. Marcus stepped back. Come in. They sat at a small table in the kitchen while afternoon light moved across the tiles, and Marcus told Dorian everything his uncle hadn't known to tell him. The full story. His father's role, not as an accomplice to Hale, but as a man who'd understood the threat and quietly, carefully built a wall against it. Shielding Marcus. Protecting the evidence. Buying years. He knew he might not live to see the end of it, Marcus said quietly. He told me to wait. To trust that when the time came, you would be the one to finish it. Pause. He was right. Dorian said nothing. He looked out the kitchen window at the garden, at the light and the quiet, and he allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what his father had carried alone. Then he set it down and began to plan. The strategy took shape over 48 hours. The evidence on the drive was Alara's. Marcus had built it, but she had verified it, authenticated it, and established the chain of custody that would make it bulletproof. The goal wasn't to release it publicly and hope for the best. Public release without structure was noise. What they needed was controlled detonation, the right material to the right people in the right sequence. Dorian had two things Alara and Marcus didn't. He had lawyers, the kind who existed specifically to navigate the territory between legal and protected. And he had contacts inside federal structures, accumulated over years of making himself useful to people who needed to not know where certain things came from. He began making quiet calls. Not to ask for help. To offer something valuable enough that help would be offered in return. The picture that was being assembled was significant. A sitting senator whose entire career was built on a criminal foundation. Financial crimes. Abuse of federal contractors. Conspiracy to obstruct. And on the De Lorenzo side, documentation that their organization had been used without knowledge or consent, manipulated from outside, which had its own legal implications. This brings scrutiny to you as well, Alara said one evening when they were working through the last pieces in his Lincoln Park space. I know, he said. You're not worried? He looked at her. Worried isn't the right word. Prepared is the right word. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something between them that had been building slowly since that first night in the velour room, not stated, not acted on, but present. The kind of thing that grows in shared pressure and late hours and the particular trust of two people who have chosen, against their natural instincts, to believe in each other. Neither of them said anything about it. There was still too much to finish first. The first pieces moved quietly. A federal investigator with a long memory and a longer record of building airtight cases received an anonymous package. Not the drive, not yet, but a preview. Specific enough to open a file. Credible enough to justify resources. Within a week, a second investigator was assigned. Within 2 weeks, a grand jury had been quietly convened in a district that had no obvious connection to Chicago. Dorian's lawyers filed 3 protective motions simultaneously, preemptive actions that established his organization's status as a non-consenting third party in what was increasingly being characterized as a criminal conspiracy directed from the outside. It was aggressive and unusual and exactly right. On Elizabeth's side, things were less quiet. Senator Hale had sensed something shifting. He moved money. He called in favors. He had 2 members of his security team reach out to individuals inside Dorian's circle with offers that were designed to create problems. 3 of those individuals declined. 1 accepted and was quietly separated from Dorian's organization before he could do damage. Elizabeth called Dorian twice. He didn't answer. She called Alara once, a number she shouldn't have had. Alara listened to the first 8 seconds, recognized the tone immediately and ended the call. The pressure was enormous and it came from multiple directions: financial, legal, personal. There were nights when the intelligence coming in from 3 different sources contradicted itself and had to be sorted by people who didn't have time to be wrong. There were moments when the timeline compressed and decisions had to be made faster than Dorian liked to make them. But the structure held. Because it had been built carefully, by people who had been waiting long enough to know the difference between a plan and a wish. The collapse of Senator Richard Hale's political empire was not a single event. It was a sequence. It began with a financial disclosure that didn't align with prior years. It moved to a quiet subpoena of records from 2 shell companies registered in Delaware. It expanded when a former aide offered a form of protection he hadn't expected, began answering questions he'd been told he'd never have to answer. And it culminated in an indictment that listed 47 specific counts across financial fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of office. Hale's lawyers fought. They always do. But the evidence was not a leak or a rumor or something that could be challenged as manufactured. It was 6 years of meticulous documentation assembled by a man who had understood from the beginning that when the moment finally came, there could be nothing uncertain in it. Marcus Vale's name never appeared in a courtroom. Alara had made sure of that, a condition she had built into every agreement from the start. He was protected. He was safe. And in a small house in Portugal with blue shutters and a well-tended garden, He sat with his coffee one morning and watched the news on a small television and watched a name he had been carrying for 6 years finally become someone else's problem. Elizabeth Hale, for her part, had known for months what was coming. She had moved assets. She had distanced herself from her father's operation with a precision that suggested she'd been preparing for this possibility for a long time. She was not indicted. She was not charged with anything. She was simply, quietly, no longer relevant, which was somehow the thing she had feared most, and which landed on her with a weight she hadn't expected. She did not contact Dorian again. For Dorian, the aftermath was neither clean nor simple. There was scrutiny. There were questions from investigators about the nature of his organization's involvement in Hale's network. But the documentation Alara had provided was precise on this point. The De Lorenzo operation had been used, not complicit. The lawyers made sure that distinction was understood by everyone who needed to understand it. And slowly, over the months that followed, Dorian De Lorenzo began to restructure. Not to dismantle what he had. He was not naive enough to think that a man in his position could walk away from what he was in the span of a single revelation. But he began to make choices differently. To think about what he was building, not just what he was protecting. To measure power not by how much fear surrounded him but by what he was using it for. Alara stayed in Chicago. She didn't go back to the velour room. She'd made sure, through quiet channels, that the restaurant understood Alara Quinn had resigned for personal reasons and was not to be contacted. He found different work. Built a different shape to her days. Let herself exist in a city that didn't know what she'd done in it. She and Dorian saw each other. Not often at first. Then more. In the Lincoln Park space above the bookshop, mostly where a plain table and a single lamp had become somehow familiar. They didn't talk about what they were to each other. They didn't need to. Some things build themselves quietly in the space between shared purpose and late nights and the particular honesty that comes from two people who have already seen each other at their most exposed. What had started with a glass of wine thrown against a white uniform, with 6 words spoken into the silence of a full restaurant, with the name of a dead man whispered across a dinner table, had become something neither of them had planned for and neither of them wanted to give back. And in a house on the coast of Portugal with blue shutters and morning light, an old man turned off the television and went out to tend his garden, and the thing he had been carrying for 6 years was finally, no longer his alone to carry. It was done. Thank you for watching.